there are harmful algal blooms, toxic algal blooms. They affect different communities around the country in a myriad of ways. In the state of Florida, they have been determined to be emergencies. They've been declared emergencies at different times. My own community has been affected by literally toxic algal blooms at some points 9 out of a dozen years in a row. And what this amendment would direct FEMA to do would be to establish criteria for determining the damage that's caused by these toxic, harmful algal blooms, which affect communities in different ways, as I already said, and establish that criteria for determining the damage, right? We deal with FEMA, with Stafford, with a host of different kinds of damage, from natural disasters, mostly like mudslides and hurricanes and fires and things like that. But what you have in some places with these algal blooms is you have disaster being caused year after year by the hand of the federal government. The hand of the federal government is creating the disaster. And I will use my own community as the specific example for this, where the EPA determined these algal blooms, microcystin that's in them, is toxic at 8 parts per billion. On this lake in Florida, Lake Okeechobee, last year it reached the level of 800 plus parts per billion. So well above the level that the EPA said, human beings, too toxic, don't come and touch it. Let's make some comparisons about this, right? Chlorine, if there's chlorine in your water, 4 parts per billion, above that, it's considered too toxic, right? If it would be like having water with chlorine that's 400 parts per billion, that would be a comparative. Or Flint, Michigan with lead, where, lead in water doesn't really reach a trigger point until 15 parts per billion. They had 200 to 10,000 parts per billion in the water in Flint, Michigan. Those were things that are disasters. So this is the way that this is a disaster in my community and many others, and we need FEMA to establish that criteria to determine how damage is caused in that way. And just to say a little bit more about how this is ridiculous with the Army Corps of Engineers, who, at least in my community, takes these algal blooms, channelizes them into canals where they are then released into more populated areas, condensing them and doing damage that no other person can do. If you are coastal and you want to put in a dock or do any construction along the water, you would have to mitigate every bit of seagrass that a piling in the water would touch. But in our community, the Corps of Engineers comes in, dumps these toxic waters into our community, and wipes out, like a forest fire underneath the water, thousands of acres of seagrass without having to mitigate a bit of it. That would be an example of how I could construe it as a disaster, and how the Corps of Engineers is backward on this. Or you take something like turtles. You can't go out there and test and touch turtle eggs or the nests or things like that on the beach. But we have turtles that literally die suspended in these toxic algal blooms that are released by the hand of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Or dolphins in the waterways. You can't go out there on your boat and look for dolphins going gracefully through the waves and try to pet them on the side of your boat. You'd be breaking the law. But the Corps of Engineers can release toxic waters in there and see these dolphins killed, washed up on shore, their source of food, the seagrass, absolutely wiped out. Those are disaster things. Things like dogs being killed from that. And then to make one other point of another way that this is a disaster for many and why FEMA needs to make these determinations, I spoke a little bit about Flint already and the water, the drinking water supply in Flint. Well, in Florida, Lake Okeechobee, where these algal blooms measured 800 parts per billion, 100 times 100x too toxic just last year, this time last year. That is a primary drinking water supply for a number of cities that sit on that lake. It is a secondary drinking water supply for a number of other cities that sit off that lake, like the city of West Palm Beach, and it's water measuring 100 times too toxic at some times for human beings to come in contact with. So, for a host of different reasons, FEMA needs to go out there, establish criteria for determining the damage caused by these harmful toxic algal blooms. Madam Chair, I thank you for the indulgence of speaking on this, and I yield back.